If you're not particularly fond of Donald Trump, you might wonder why you're not hearing much from alternative political voices. Over the weekend, there were actually 1,200 protests against the president in United States towns and cities. But what about the political party whose role it is supposed to be to oppose him? Well, the Democrats have endured 5 months of soul-searching since November's election. They still don't have a figurehead nor an obvious focus. Many, including Bernie Sanders, the left-wing senator, say they need to win back the working classes. But is it as simple as that? Hank Sheinkopf is a Democratic strategist and joined me now. Good afternoon, Hank.
Good afternoon. How are you doing today?
I'm very well, but the important thing is, how are you, the Democrats, doing? Is it fair to say that right now the only real opposition to Trump is coming from the stock market?
Well, the Democrats are they're really not a party anymore in my estimation. They're a bunch of clans
Wow.
with particular special interests that tie together only on elections, whether they be local or national elections. And then they identify as people who are opposed or for candidates in office, but not much else. There's not an ideological drive that is consistent among them, and that's one of the reasons why they're in such trouble.
Well, that's quite a claim. Sorry, Hank. What the heck happened to the Democrats then? How did they fall apart?
They fell apart because they it's kind of Reaganism brought to its crescendo. You know, what Ronald Reagan was able to do was to strip out white, blue-collar, working-class people from large portions of the Democratic Party electorate, and they never went back. And they've seesawed between particular candidates. I mean, they liked Bill Clinton to some extent because his economic policies were good. Some of them liked other candidates, but not at the extent they did. The other thing that happened was the labor movement in the United States, organized labor, fell apart, which was frankly both the enforcer within the Democratic Party and the mechanism by which many voters turned out to vote. And they don't have the strength they do anymore. They're split between private sector labor, people who work on, in jobs outside government, and public sector labor. Public sector labor being more on the left, and private sector labor being more on the right. And there's not enough labor union people left to do any of it. So it is a very difficult set of circumstances for Democrats. Their enforcement mechanisms within the party are gone. They have no real ideological cause to hold on to. The people that they're supposed to service don't care for them anymore. And it's become a party of elites, which is why the Republicans have done so well over time.
Was part of the problem, if I can put it that way, the Hillary Clinton leadership, that to some extent she looked like part of that elite to which you just referred?
Well, you raise an important point. The resentment among those who jobs have been lost from the heartland, the United States, the Midwest, who lifestyles have been changed by the changes in the cities, and their dislike of the Hillary Clinton wing of the party is that they hate the elites. They blame them. That's New York City, Washington, and Los Angeles. And they believe people who come from that milieu and that educational basis, as they see it, whatever the definition may be on a particular day, are responsible for the chaos they've experienced, for the dislocation economically and socially, and for the societal changes that have just changed their whole world. Look, if you were a member of the United Automobile Workers of America, for example, let's say before Ronald Reagan, and when the plants were still functioning, and your whole life was around the plant, and you had a very simple system. You went to the Army, you grew up, you went to the Army, you came back, you replaced your father on the assembly line, your son did the same thing, he replaced you. You all lived in the same community. You went to the same parish, church, largely Catholic populations. Your lifestyle was very much around those institutions. Now the institutions are gone because the communities have changed, because the plant's gone, because people have left, and they're never going to get past it, and they're going to keep blaming people for it for generations, and that's essentially what's going on since the 60s. Is there an end to it? I'm not sure.
Well, Hank, I think it's very, very interesting what you just said, because you could almost have been describing what we here call the red wall. That is to say, the industrial towns of, particularly in the north of England, they're not exclusively so, that were built on coal and iron and chemicals and so on, who had pretty much the same fate. And the sort of person you might be describing actually could be epitomized by one J.D. Vance. And anybody who's read his book, Hillbilly Elegy, will recognize that background. Do you think it's possible? I mean, or let me put it this way. Do you think that what's now happened is that that strain of the Republican Party, who's been remade in Donald Trump's image, possibly going to be inherited by J.D. Vance, has now permanently detached that blue-collar vote?
I think to some extent that's a valid observation. It's detached it. It's more angry than it's ever been. It sees what is left of whatever that lifestyle is, both from a communal and an economic standpoint, being destroyed once and for all, and hateful to the core. It is late Reaganism. I think it's the end of Reaganism in the United States, and I think, frankly, it is a clarion call to the West overall to do something about people before they completely lose their minds and do the most outrageous things electorally, which they've done in the UK and they've done now in the United States, which is they're trying to find populists to vote for, who in fact are not populists at all, but as elite, if not more so, than the people they seek to replace.
So where does democratic leadership come from now? I mean, we read about the figures that are coming through. AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, or let's say Cory Booker, the senator from New Jersey, and so on. My friends in America talk to me about the governor of Maryland, I think it is, in Westmore. And is Kamala Harris now dead? I mean, where is the leadership going to come from?
Kamala Harris, I think, has seen her moment and is gone. They ran such an awful campaign, spent $1 billion, which is another part of the problem. We have in the United States what I've been calling the political industrial complex. And when I was a young political consultant, I worked all over the world, and I did a lot of work in the United States. If you didn't win your races, your campaigns, you didn't eat. Now, with public financing of campaigns, they don't have to worry. They can lose, and there's no sanction. And nationally, if you lose, it's okay because the institutional players in Washington will make sure you keep eating. So it's a vicious cycle. The Democrats win by default almost, not by great events that they create or invent or are parts of fashioning. So where does the Democratic Party leadership come from? That's the other thing that is making the blue-collar people that I talked about, which is frankly the social class that I come from, what's making them more nuts is the fact that the demographic shift is overwhelming. Less than 50% of the people in the United States living here today can claim their heritage to Europe, which is an extraordinary thing. This country is changing demographically at a very rapid rate. The so-called Latinos, I don't like that phrase, but people who come from that term, who come from Spanish-speaking cultures and societies are becoming much more pronounced. The Asian population is increasing exponentially. And whenever you have these kinds of groups in motion, you always have competition for resources that, if not resolved, can turn violent and with long-term standing disputes, which are in fact, earned. They're not by accident.
This is such an interesting point, Hank, because I remember 15, 20 years ago, the story that the Democrats were telling themselves was that demographic change in the United States, which, as you say, would lead to a situation where at least half the population, and possibly more, were either immigrants or the children of immigrants. We now have, I can't remember what the exact numbers of Latino heritage people, but it's going to climb, I think, to about 120 million people in the United States. That this would build in a permanent anti-Republican majority for the Democrats. Completely wrong. And in fact, I read that after the election that Donald Trump had taken, I think, something like a quarter of African-American men's votes, much more amongst Latinos.
Sure.
What went wrong for the Democrats?
They got confused. Instead of being a party of economics and party of economics and a party of organization. They become a party of clans. What do I mean by that? It became more important to talk about transgender rights than it did to talk about educating children. It became more pronounced to talk about gay rights than it did to talk about things that are important. And frankly, those issues were alienating to what would have been the traditional Democrats, and that is an unfortunate occurrence. Now, I'm not talking about my own feelings about such issues. What I'm talking about is what didn't work for Democrats. So as long as they stress issues like that, or perceive to stress them, they will continue losing elections. Why? Donald Trump's most effective ad on television, in my view, was people talking about how they don't want to hear those kinds of things, and that's their business, not the government's business, and not the political party's business. And the end result is that they lost the election. And this was not a small loss for Democrats when you look at the real numbers. This is significant. In the states they should have won, and that is the difference.
Well, Hank Sheinkopf, Democratic strategist, thank you so much for your time this morning.